This is Sociology 3341, Marriage and the Family, and we're on week 3. This lecture will be examining the methods that sociologists use to study topics related to marriage and family. Many disciplines look at this study, or they study family and family issues. Those perspectives are different. We thought about that last week when we saw a video about the sociological imagination, and we read Stephanie Kunz's article about how sociologists and historians think about the family and how these family issues are set in a social context. That's different than how other disciplines might look at family topics of family, marriage, and parenting, those types of issues. Biologists, of course, will look at issues related to the family, but they're looking at genetic relationships. Maybe they'll focus on disease, different things related to our physiology and our biological relationships to family and family members. A criminologist, which isn't always so different from what sociologists study, but a criminologist could look at issues related to crime in the family, maybe a generational incarceration rates. Does that carry from generation to generation, or the propensity of someone to be arrested if their parents have been arrested. They might look at issues of domestic violence or child abuse. It'll be specific to topics of crime in the family. Law, we could look at inheritance law. History, of course, we would look at changes in the family over time. Economic relationships within the family, and the psychology of the family, or emotional attachments, maybe the psychological impact of particular parenting styles or events that occur when we might be children. All of those things are ways in which we different disciplines look and explore issues of the family. Sociologists might look at very similar issues. You're reading a book on history of childhood in America, but it's a little bit distinct in how we approach different questions. Again, we covered this last week when we talked about the sociological, or you saw the TED Talk on the sociological imagination. One thing that sociologists do bring to the study that isn't always true of some of the other disciplines is that culture matters, values matter. We might look at how the family works in conjunction with other social institutions. We don't take a psychological view that this is the family impacts one individual. We would situate the family again in a broader social context, kind of looking at the forest and not particularly one tree or one family or one individual's experience in the family. In terms of approaching the family from a social science perspective, and if we were to have a question, or we pose a question about the family, we have 3 goals or 3 ways that we can look at a particular question. We want to describe what's going on. So I want to look at child rearing practices and how child rearing practices are different now than they were even just 10 years ago. I want to describe what parenting techniques are being used now. So what's happening? I'd like to try and explain why this is happening. How do I explain why it's happening? Well, a lot of times you might do interviews, or we might look at cultural trends, or we might look at economic changes. All of these different things might come to bear to help us explain why a particular style of child rearing has developed and become popular. And then a lot of times social scientists will also try to evaluate whether those things will have a positive or negative impact on society. What are some policies that can be changed to improve or help families? What are some social forces that are making it difficult for families to perform parenting tasks or caring for their children? So a sociologist will describe what it is, will explain why it happens, and then oftentimes that next step comes in how can we improve situations if there's a social problem? How can we encourage through policy and through other social mechanisms to continue doing things that are already good? One of the things I like to think about when we talk about methodologies or the methods by which we study these questions is I like to step back and think a little bit about the philosophy of knowledge. If any of you have had a philosophy class, you might be more familiar with some of these terms than others. But one of the questions I think is always really interesting is how do we know what we know? And there are two words that kind of go with this and come out of a philosophical frame of reference. One is ontology, and ontology means what can we know? Are there things around us that we actually can know something about? Can we know what beauty is? Can we know what a family really is? What can we know and what can we not know? And there are oftentimes things that we can ask the questions, but we're not necessarily able to find those answers. We're not able to know them. Religion often deals with ontological questions. What can we know and what can we not? Can we know things about God, and what can we not know about God, or what do we not know? So I like this idea that we try to think about what can we actually know about this topic. Are there things that are just simply unknowable? Epistemology is a word that tries to answer the question, how do we know what we know? If we can know it, then how do we know we know that thing? And I've given you a couple of videos attached here that help explain these ideas too. But epistemology, we would say there are multiple ways of knowing, or there are many different ways in which we come to understand something and understand it well. The video talks about approaches that argue that philosophical traditions that argue that we can only know things through experience, that I can only know something if I've actually lived that experience or I've had that experience. Others would say, well, no, we can come to understanding because we can intellectually understand things. We can work through a rational process and really understand some things. Others would argue it's a combination of the two. But this idea that we can know things, and we do have ways in which we can know things, is really important. When I was in my sociology courses, one of the professors talked about how you could bring 4 people to view a field, and you might have an artist, a scientist, a botanist, and a politician, and they would all see the field, but they would come away knowing something different about that field. The artist might see color and come back and talk about how wonderful the color was and how that is an important way to experience nature. The botanist might look specifically at the flower. This is a really unique flower. It's an endangered flower, and talk about that particular, the importance of that flower in the field. The politician might look at the field as the natural resources that it could provide, what's underneath, the field, and so on. So they might experience the same thing, but come to know it in very, very different ways. And that's one of the core ideas behind epistemology. How do we know what we know, and then how do we know that that's actually true and accurate? So how do we know things about the family? Well, there are epistemological approaches in sociology that help inform us about our findings, about our questions, about what we want to learn about, and how we can learn about those things. One is an interpretive way of knowing, or an interpretive goal in the study of families. The other is a critical approach to the study of families, and then we have a scientific approach. The interpretive approach would be focusing on learning about human behavior that we can observe up close. And by that I mean we look for ways that people describe their own lives and they make meaning of their own lives. This would be, if you can imagine someone doing a series of interviews or observations where they watch several families interact. They look at those interactions. They ask people to interpret their own interactions and give meaning to their own interactions. That would be an interpretive way of learning about the family, or of knowing things about the family. So we might ask questions like, well, how do we feel about our families? What does the family mean? What do I hope to get out of marriage? All those types of questions require kind of an interpretive approach to learning about the family. There are also critical approaches to family research, and we'll talk more about some critical theories and how they apply to the family. But a critical approach is similar to the interpretive approach in that it focuses on how people interpret the situations that they're in. But it differs in that there is a pragmatic or an applied approach attached to that. So we want to interpret what's going on. We want to identify any problems. And then we also want to provide some kind of action or advocacy to help solve those problems. Generally, critical studies of the family are done in small groups or cross-culturally. The people who are the researched or the people who are studied tend to have a high level of participation and a collaboration in the research. And critical research approaches in this area would try to find problems, try to identify if there are problems, and then find solutions to those problems. It's a combination between using the scientific method, which we'll talk about, and then advocacy, or the researcher as an advocate for that particular group. We would also use, and this is very common if you come from a psychology or a criminal justice background, there might be more traditional ways of knowing based on the scientific method, and we would call these scientific ways of knowing. This is based on positivist principles. I don't know if you're familiar with positivism as, again, a philosophical school of thought, but positivism began to develop in the 19th century, and it really shapes how we think about the world around us now. And some of the main ideas behind positivist schools of thought is that, first of all, ontologically, we can know about the world. It's not a mystery. It doesn't rain because the gods will it. We can scientifically know why it rains. So the world around us is very knowable. We can know what's underneath the sea because we can examine what's underneath the sea, and it's not a mystery to us. We can come to an understanding of what our world is like. Not only can we come to an understanding, we can test and retest and begin to understand phenomena that are consistent across time, across place. We can begin to make predictions based on our observations. So in applying the scientific method, we can understand what might happen in the future because we've tested, retested, and been able to replicate the same findings. We could say that there's two forms of scientific inquiry: exploratory inquiry. This would be, we could also say that it's based on an inductive reasoning or theory building. And by those things, I mean we're we're asking questions to build more questions, basically. It would be the first step in a research enterprise. What do I want to know, and what are some of the related questions that come up around it? I'm not trying to determine whether ice cream causes the murder rate to increase, and that's kind of a classic example of that's used a lot in talk about methods of research. But I'm just exploring the topic. We did a study at one point on drug use and online communities, how online communities discuss their drug use. Well, there hadn't been a whole lot of work done on this. In fact, none really at that time. And so there was no theory to apply to it. We just began to ask questions and look through the discussions that were posted online, do interviews with people who were participants in these online subcultures, and began to develop a collection of questions that might be tested later on down the road. But that testing wasn't part of our exercise. Our job was to explore particular types of issues related to drug use and how people become educated about drug use online. Now, the other form of inquiry is explanatory, or it's deductive. We're trying to determine causality, or we're trying to test particular theories. Does online information cause an increase in drug use? So I'm testing access to online information and increases in drug use. That's a deductive, or I'm testing out theories there. Theories of communication, theories of how people respond to different methods of communication. That's theory testing. And that requires its own methodology. It has its own set of goals at the end of the study. Now, how do these methods of inquiry kind of pan out in terms of methods? I'm not going to go into this too much because I'm assuming most of you have had some type of method class at this point, or research methods class. But oftentimes we see sociological methods categorized in two big clusters. The first would be quantitative methods, and then qualitative methods. Oftentimes, qualitative methods are used to answer questions that come up in the exploratory phases of research. And these would be things like content analysis. When I mentioned the discussion groups that are the online discussions, we would just basically take those discussions and pour through them and read over them and find themes. That's content analysis. What's being said, and how are people making meaning of what they've said, or how are people understanding what other people are saying. You could do the same with historical documents. Huck's Raft is based on an analysis of historical documents, interviews, focus groups where small groups of people come together and respond to a topic or answer questions related to a topic. You can just simply observe. There was a really interesting study that was done of boys and girls and how they communicate, and it was based on observation. And basically the researcher sat in a schoolyard and recorded and observed the interaction between girls and the interaction between boys. And she went back and she coded what she heard, and she put it in context of her observations, and she came back and her conclusions were really interesting. That girls, when they played, they used words, and they communicated verbally, but with words. Boys communicated verbally actually more than girls, but they didn't necessarily use words, that they relied a lot on sound and noises, and their play was less verbal, and it was noisy but less verbal. That's interesting, and that's something that you probably wouldn't learn except for by using observational techniques. Quantitative methods, I like to see the difference between qualitative and quantitative methods. Qualitative methods, you deal with words. quantitative methods, you deal with numbers, and that's simplistic, but that's an easy way to kind of remember the difference between the two. Quantitative methods might rely on experiments for the data that they collect. There have been a lot of experiments in terms of the impact of, related to the impact of violent media on children. A lot of that work is experimental, where children or adolescents are brought into an office or a testing site, and they're shown violent movies or violent TV, or they play violent games, and then they watch their behavior after the fact and see how they play and communicate later to kind of measure if levels of aggression have increased, if their verbalization changes. That would be an experiment, and that would produce, in that way, it would produce both quantitative and qualitative data, depending on how it was conducted. But for the most part, that experiments will give you some form of, if it's maybe you'll take a survey online after you watch, or you'll have to fulfill a task, complete a test after you've watched some violent video. That would provide numbers. That would be a quantitative study. We can conduct surveys, look at available data sets, look at the findings. Basically, that's data that's already been collected through other surveys. Any kind of quantifiable record that might already be collected by government agencies. And then quantitative studies generally try to look for causation between two variables. So does X cause Y? Do we have a strong relationship? And your book points out that, of course, and again, I don't want to be repetitive because you probably have heard a lot of this before, but your book makes a note that there's a difference between a correlation and a causative relationship. Correlation would be simply that two variables, as two variables are highly related to each other. Now, I mentioned the ice cream in the summer and the murder rates before. We do know that ice cream consumption and murder rates are correlated, that murder rates increase, and as murder rates increase, ice cream consumption also increases. They're correlated. They both follow the same trajectory at the same time. That'd be a positive correlation because they're both increasing. A negative correlation would be one where as one increases, the other decreases, that they're negatively correlated. But ice cream, we do know that ice cream consumption and murder and violent crime rates are correlated. They both move in the same direction. That correlation, though, isn't caused. The relationship is spurious, and by that I mean that ice cream doesn't cause murder to occur, and murderers don't go back and eat ice cream. They don't have a causal relationship at all. In fact, when we say it's spurious, it's caused by a third event, that there's a third factor that's influencing both ice cream consumption and rates of violent crime, and that would be heat. Heat in the summer, so we're looking at time and weather, that those two things are actually causing the increases in ice cream and violent crime. So those concepts are discussed in your book and will show up on your exam. But this is just an overview of some of the methodological issues that methodological topics that we talk about when we talk about studying the family, when we talk about social science methods being applied to the study of family. Your book, if I'm remembering correctly, goes into a lot of detail about statistical relationships and statistical analyses, more than I think a text should do. A text that's not a statistics text should do. You're not required. That that specific material won't show up on the exam. Some of the broader concepts like correlation, causation, and some of the broader categories of methods will show up. So when you're reading the chapter for week 3, remember that I believe your book goes into a lot more detail than I'll require on the exam. Okay, I hope you have a good week, and we'll talk soon.